The first thing I remember is the silence, not the peaceful kind that comes after a hard-won battle, but the suffocating stillness of a place that has already accepted extinction as routine, a silence so heavy it pressed against my ears until I realized it wasn't silence at all, but restraint, a galaxy holding its breath because screaming had become pointless. And when my feet touched the ground, I knew instantly I was no longer in the world of chakra-scarred forests and hidden villages, because the earth beneath me was not soil but pulverized stone mixed with ash and bone, compacted by centuries of marching armies. And the sky above was a bruised cathedral of clouds split by permanent lightning that never reached the ground, illuminating titanic Gothic spires rising like gravestones for entire civilizations. I inhaled and tasted metal, oil, incense, and something older fear that had soaked into the air so deeply it had become atmospheric, and my instincts screamed at me to move, to hide, but there was nowhere to hide in a place built to watch itself die in the open. I reached inward for chakra and felt it respond immediately, warm and familiar, a living current that anchored me against the crushing wrongness of this reality. Yet, when I pushed outward, reality itself seemed to resist, as if my presence violated some unspoken law, and that was when the pressure arrived. Not like Kurama's vast, burning presence, but something colder, broader, a psychic gravity that dragged at my thoughts, layered with countless voices chanting in despair, prayer, obedience, all directed toward a distant, blinding psychic beacon I could sense but not see, a god thing bound to a throne of pain, holding back an ocean of madness by sheer will alone. I staggered as the truth settled into me. This galaxy survived not through balance, not through bonds, but through endless sacrifice. And before I could process that, horror movement shattered the smoke ahead, massive armored figures emerging like walking fortresses, each step cracking the ground, their armor thick with scars and purity seals, red lenses locking onto me with mechanical precision. And when one spoke, it was not a voice, but a verdict, vox distorted and absolute, declaring me an unregistered anomaly, a witch, a threat to the Emperor's dominion. And I felt a bitter familiarity twist in my chest, because I had been labeled a monster before by people who saw power but not the person inside it. The first bolt round detonated near my shoulder with a concussive roar, not a bullet but a miniature explosive that tore the air apart, heat and shrapnel ripping past me as instinct took over, my body moving before thought, shadow clones bursting into existence only to be obliterated in showers of gore and smoke, each death slamming back into my mind with violent feedback that made my vision blur, because here even copies died brutally. I dodged and countered, my chakra-reinforced strike-denting armor that had survived orbital fire, and for the first time I saw hesitation ripple through the giants, not fear, but confusion. Their doctrines failing to account for something that was neither Xenos nor Psyker nor demon, just a human who refused to break. Then the warp screamed, the sky tearing open like infected flesh as demonic shapes clawed their way into reality, drawn not to me but to the violence itself, because in this universe war was not a means to an end. It was nourishment, and when I felt their hunger brush against my soul, I realized something terrifying. They weren't interested in my power, they were interested in my hope. I called on the Nine Tails, and golden chakra erupted around me, a living sun colliding with the sickly Imperium bleed, and the warp recoiled violently, demons shrieking as my presence disrupted their existence, not through faith or sorcery but through raw, defiant will. And somewhere impossibly far away, something ancient turned its attention toward me. Not with love or hatred, but with cold curiosity, as if the galaxy itself had noticed an error in its design. The Space Marines regrouped, firing discipline tightening, but I saw it then, etched into every banner and skull icon and corpse-choked streets. This Imperium did not fight to protect life, it fought to delay annihilation, and that realization hurt more than any wound, because how do you save a universe that no longer believes it deserves saving? As explosions tore through the ruins and prayers echoed through Vox channels like funeral chants, I stood amid fire and ash and understood with a sinking certainty that my arrival here was not an accident, that my chakra was not just power in this galaxy but a contradiction, and that if I failed, this universe would not mourn me, it would simply absorb my death into its endless accounting of losses. But if I succeeded even a little, then, for the first time in 10,000 years, something impossible might happen. Hope might survive contact with reality. I did not realize how loud hope was until the galaxy tried to smother it, because the moment the last bolter shell stopped echoing through the ruins and the smoke thinned, I felt eyes on me that were not physical, not even truly sentient in the way humans understood it, but vast, distributed, bureaucratic, an entire civilization turning its attention toward a single impossible variable. And the realization crept into my bones that I had not merely survived a skirmish, had triggered an investigation. The Space Marines withdrew in perfect formation, disciplined even in confusion. Their vox traffic crackling with codes and liturgies I could not decipher, but the psychic pressure intensified instead of fading. A crushing scrutiny layered with fear masquerading as faith, and I staggered as the warp pressed. Closer, not attacking outright, but testing, probing, tasting the shape of my soul, the way predators circle unfamiliar prey. As I moved through the ruins, I saw the remnants of the Imperium's Mersey civilians huddled in prayer pits, their bodies starved thin, faces carved hollow by devotion and terror, skulls nailed to walls, not as warnings but as icons. And it struck me with a sickening clarity that these people did not live for tomorrow, they endured for permission to exist one more day. And when some of them saw me glowing faintly with residual chakra, they did not run, they fell to their knees, mistaking me for another cruel miracle sent to test their obedience. And I wanted to scream at them to stand up, to stop bowing to everything that hurt them, but the words died in my throat, because here defiance was heresy and heresy was extinction. The Inquisition arrived without fanfare, their presence announced not by sound but by absence, as if the air itself recoiled, black ships descending like execution warrants made manifest. And when their psychers reached out to me, I felt it instantly: thin, invasive tendrils scraping across my thoughts, searching for the familiar signature of warp corruption, demonic pact, or sanctioned psychic discipline. And what they found instead made them recoil in alarm, because my chakra did not echo the warp, did not draw from it, did not bargain with it. It existed parallel to it, a closed system fueled by will and life, rather than madness and belief, and that terrified them more than any demon ever could. I felt the first sanctioned psyker scream as he tried to force a connection that wasn't there, his mind collapsing inward under the strain of touching something that refused to obey the rules of this universe. And suddenly alarms blared, not for an invasion but for a classification failure, the worst sin in an empire built on categorization. Because if I could not be labeled, I could not be controlled. They called me a null, then rejected that, called me a witch, then panicked when their wards failed, called me xenostutched, then recoiled when genetic scans returned human. And in that chaos I sensed something darker stirring, something ancient and patient, a god that fed on secrets and changed, turning its attention toward me with interest sharpened into hunger, because I was not aligned with any of them and therefore threatened all of them. As interrogator servitors advanced, their voices droning catechisms about purity and obedience, I realized the true horror of this place was not the demons or the war, but the certainty, the absolute conviction that suffering was necessary, that hope was dangerous, that survival required the slow execution of empathy. And for the first time since I was a child, I doubted myself, because how do you fight a belief system carved into an entire galaxy's bones? When I resisted, not with violence but by simply refusing to break, the Inquisition escalated, deploying psychic dampeners that should have crushed any psyker into a screaming vegetable. And when they failed to even slow me, panic rippled outward like a contagion, their faith cracking under empirical evidence that contradicted 10,000 years of doctrine. And somewhere on Holy Terra a High Lord would feel a chill without knowing why. The warp surged again, not violently but eagerly. Demonic whispers slithering closer, promising me acceptance, power, belonging, offering to translate my chakra into something they could consume. And the temptation horrified me, not because I wanted it, but because I understood how icily someone desperate could accept it in a universe like this, and that understanding made my chest ache with a grief so deep it felt like drowning. When I pushed back, anchoring myself in memories of bonds and promises and people who believed in me when the world didn't. The warp screamed in frustration, reality stabilizing around me as if my very presence imposed a foreign law upon it. And that was the moment the Imperium truly noticed me, not as a weapon, not as an enemy, but as a destabilizing influence. A crack in the dam holding back madness, because if one human could exist outside the Emperor's psychic shadow, then the Emperor was no longer the only answer. As I escaped into the depths of the hive, pursued by machines and prayers and silent terror, I understood that I had become something worse than a heretic. In their eyes I had become proof that another way might exist. And in a galaxy built on despair, proof was the most dangerous thing of all. The warp did not announce itself with fire or screaming this time, because it did not need to. It simply leaned closer, like a thought you cannot stop thinking once it has taken root. And as I ran through maintenance corridors slick with oil and blood, pursued by servo skulls chanting execution litanies and the distant thunder of boots that shook the hive's bones, I felt the attention of God settle on me one by one, not in unison but in curiosity, like carrion birds circling something that refused to die. The first pressure was rage so pure it felt honest, a furnace of endless battle that seeped into my muscles and made every strike I imagined feel righteous, And I knew without being told that this was the god of blood and slaughter, Khorne, whose realm fed on conflict stripped of reason. And when a chaos incursion erupted ahead of Mithrada Astartes spilling from a breach in reality, chainblades screaming, armor daubed in old gore, I felt his approval surge as combat became inevitable. And for a heartbeat the temptation was real, because here strength was currency and mercy was weakness. And the idea of ending threats permanently with overwhelming force pressed against my instincts like gravity. I fought anyway, but I fought differently, redirecting blows, disabling rather than annihilating when I could, and each choice felt like pushing upstream against a cosmic current, my chakra flaring not in fury but in control, and I sensed Khorne's interest cool, not in disappointment but in confusion, because violence without hatred starved him. Then the air grew thick and sweet with rot, wounds that should have closed festered, and laughter bubbled from the walls themselves as Nurglite corruption seeped into the hive, plague-bearers waddling through collapsing corridors, offering me acceptance, endurance, an end to the pain through surrender. And I saw how seductive that was in a universe where suffering never stopped, where giving up could feel like rest, and the horror of it tightened my chest, because I understood that despair here was not weakness, it was survival conditioning. I burned the corruption away with chakra refined into heat and motion, cleansing rather than destroying, and Nurgle's attention drifted, amused but unfulfilled, because I would not embrace decay. The third presence was sharper, colder, a blade of thought that dissected possibilities, Dizinch, whispering futures into my mind, showing me how easily I could rule, manipulate, reshape this galaxy if I just learned to speak the warp's language. If I just accepted that belief was power, and power rewrote truth, and the visions were terrifying not because they were false but because they could be real, because I saw myself becoming something efficient and empty, and I rejected them with a clarity that surprised me, anchoring myself in the simple promise I had made long ago to never abandon who I was. And for the first time the changer of ways recoiled, not in anger, but in calculation, because unpredictability without ambition disrupted even him. The last presence did not press or tempt, it caressed, slannish, slipping into the spaces between thoughts, offering sensation, meaning, a way to feel alive in a galaxy numb with suffering. And I felt the danger there most of all, because it spoke to loneliness, to the ache of being utterly alone in a universe that wanted me either dead or worshipped, and I clenched my fists until my nails bit into my palms. Grounding myself in pain, I chose, not pain imposed, and the caress withdrew, displeased. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The Chaos Gods could not easily claim me because my power did not originate from them, and that made me a problem, a contaminant, something that could weaken their monopoly on hope and despair alike, and that was why the warp grew unstable around me, not exploding but stuttering, as if reality itself struggled to decide which rules applied. The traitor Astartes fell back, confused as their demonic allies flickered and thinned, and I stood amid the aftermath, breathing hard, realizing that every step I took rewrote local metaphysics in small but meaningful ways, and that terrified me more than any enemy, because power without a map was how monsters were born. The Imperium responded with escalation, because escalation was all it knew, deploying Sisters of Silence whose pariah aura gnawed at my senses like static, not nullifying my chakra but making it harder to shape. Their presence a void that hurt to look at, and when they advanced with bolters raised, chanting prayers, not in hope but in certainty, I felt a surge of sadness so intense it nearly stopped me, because these women existed to erase anomalies like me, living proof that the Imperium feared what it could not dominate. I fled again, not out of fear but out of necessity, because killing them would only prove the galaxy right about me, and as I disappeared into the I felt the gods withdraw slightly, reassessing, and the Imperium's psychic beacon flare brighter in response, a wounded animal bracing itself. Alone in the dark, surrounded by forgotten people and broken machines, I finally understood the shape of the war I had entered. Not a war of armies or even of gods, but a war over the definition of humanity itself. Because if humans could draw power from something other than terror, obedience, or madness, then this galaxy's cruel equilibrium would collapse. And as the realization settled, heavy and irrevocable, I knew that from this moment on, every choice I made would echo far beyond any battlefield, and that the true horror was not that I might fail, but that I might succeed and be forced to watch an entire civilization relearn how to live. The Imperium did not try to kill me immediately after that, and the delay frightened me more than any bolter barrage ever could, because hesitation in this galaxy meant deliberation, and deliberation meant a decision was being shaped far above any battlefield, in vaulted chambers where men and women decided the fate of worlds with ink and prayer. And as I moved through forgotten transit, Tunnels lit by flickering lumen strips sheltering among the dispossessed and the half-full survivors who lived where the administrator no longer bothered to count. I felt the pressure change, becoming focused, refined, no longer the blunt weight of authority but the cold precision of analysis, as if the galaxy itself was trying to understand me. It began with whispers among the people who saw me, not the hysterical worship I feared, but something quieter and more dangerous curiosity, because when I shared food instead of taking it, when I healed a dying child without demanding prayer or obedience, when I spoke to them like people instead of resources, something fragile stirred in their eyes, and I realized with a sinking certainty that kindness here was an act of rebellion. The ecclesiarchy noticed first, their preachers' sermons growing sharper, louder, more frantic, warning of false lights and unapproved miracles, and I listened from the shadows as they described me as a test sent by the Emperor to expose the weak, twisting my existence into another justification for cruelty. And that hurt in a way no wound ever had, because I understood then how this system survived. It consumed even contradiction and turned it into reinforcement. The Inquisition's response was subtler, deploying not soldiers but envoys, robed figures flanked by dead and sanctioned psychers who approached with measured politeness, offering me a place, a role, containment masquerading as partnership, explaining in calm, reasonable tones that the Imperium could protect humanity only if anomalies like me were studied, controlled, weaponized. And I felt a familiar anger rise, because I had heard those words before from people who believed ends justified any means, and I answered them honestly, telling them I did not want to rule, convert or destroy, that I only wanted to help people live without fear. And the silence that followed was heavier than violence, because they genuinely could not pass a motive that did not fit into conquest or control. They warned me then, softly, that unchecked hope was destabilizing, that belief systems were load-bearing structures in the Imperium, that removing fear without replacing it with obedience would cause collapse, famine, war. And I realized the most horrifying truth yet, that the Imperium was not entirely wrong, that this civilization had been built so long on terror that removing it suddenly would be catastrophic. And the weight of that responsibility nearly crushed me, because saving people here might kill billions elsewhere. As debates raged across Vox networks and astropathic choirs strained to interpret my presence, the warp reacted again, not with rage but with anxiety. Minor demonic manifestations flickering out unpredictably, cult rituals failing, sorcerers reporting that certain emotional frequencies no longer resonated the way they should, and I felt a grim understanding settle in my chest that my mere existence was starving the gods in places where I stayed too long, not by force but by changing the emotional ecology. And that made me a target for chaos, not as an enemy but as an existential threat. The Space Marines returned, not in squads but in a full chapter deployment, their banners unfurled, their chants echoing through the hive like a funeral procession. And when their chapter master confronted me, his voice was calm, almost respectful. He did not call me a heretic, only a risk, explaining that humanity could not afford uncontrolled variables, that hope must be rationed like ammunition. And I saw in his eyes not hatred but exhaustion, the weariness of someone who had watched hope get people killed for centuries. I told him about my world, about bonds, about how people grew stronger together instead of being ground down alone. And I knew even as I spoke that my words sounded like madness here. And when he finally answered, he did so with brutal honesty, saying that if his warriors laid down their fear, they would hesitate, and hesitation would doom humanity. And in that moment I understood that this was not a battle of good and evil, but of survival philosophies, both forged in fire. The standoff ended not with violence, but with a decree from Terra itself, transmitted through a choir of astropaths whose eyes bled as they spoke it, declaring me excommunicate extremis, not for corruption but for influence. And I felt the psychic beacon of the Emperor flare in distant response, not condemning me, not welcoming me, but acknowledging me. A silent pressure like the gaze of a mountain, and for a fleeting instant I sensed a presence bound in agony and duty, a god who might once have believed in something like I did, and the thought nearly broke me. Hunted now by Imperium and chaos alike, sheltering among the forgotten, I felt the weight of the path ahead settle fully onto my shoulders, because I could no longer pretend this was about surviving or escaping. This was about choice, about whether a single person could introduce compassion into a system that had optimized it out. And as alarms echoed through the hive and the first shells of planetary suppression began to fall, I realized the true horror was not that this galaxy was cruel, but that it had become cruel because it believed it had no other option. And if I failed to show another way, then this universe would continue screaming into the void forever, convinced that suffering was the only language reality understood. The first shells fell like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence the Imperium had already decided to finish, not screaming down with rage, but descending with bureaucratic finality, cyclonic warheads tearing through the upper hive districts in controlled patterns designed to cauterize rebellion. And as the ground trembled beneath the underhive, I sheltered with people who had never been asked what they wanted, only what they could endure, feeling the Emperor's distant beacon flare again, as if bracing for loss. And I understood that this was the moment the galaxy forced choices upon you, because in this place neutrality was a myth and survival demanded alignment. Chaos moved at the same time, cult cells igniting like infected wounds, sorcerers trying desperately to exploit the instability around me, Nurgle's rot seeping into water systems, Zinch's agents attempting to manipulate evacuation routes into traps, Slanish's whispers thickening with promises of release from responsibility, and for the first time since arriving, I felt truly overwhelmed, not by strength but by scale, because saving individuals here was easy compared to saving a system designed to collapse without terror as its glue. The Imperium's ultimatum arrived via Voxgol hovering before me, its voice flat and formal, offering me a final choice: submit to containment for the good of humanity, or be eradicated along with the population I had influenced. And the people around me listened in silence, not pleading, not cursing, simply waiting, and that broke something inside me, because they had learned that hope was something done to them, not something they were allowed to claim. I answered without raising my voice, telling the Imperium that I would not fight them for power, that I would not overthrow their structures, that all I would do was stand here and refuse to let fear be the only reason people obeyed. And the Voxgol recorded my words like evidence at a trial already decided. When the Chaos assault hit in full, the underhive became a pressure cooker of collapsing tunnels and panicked movement, and I stepped forward not as a weapon but as a barrier chakra spreading outward in controlled waves that stabilized reality instead of tearing it, calming the emotional spikes that fed the warp. And the effect was immediate and horrifying in its simplicity. Demonic manifestations flickered and thinned. Cultists hesitated their rituals, losing cohesion as despair bled away. And the gods reacted with fury, not because I struck them, but because I starved them, and the backlash nearly tore me apart as warp energies lashed out blindly, the sky above fracturing into sickly auroras. Space Marines entered the underhive in force, bolters raised, but they slowed as they advanced their targeting augers, struggling to reconcile a battlefield where psychic noise was dropping instead of spiking, where civilians were not screaming but organizing, helping one another move through rubble. And I saw something I had never expected to see in this galaxy: hesitation born not of doubt, but of unfamiliarity with mercy. I spoke to them as they approached, telling them they did not need to lay down their arms, only their certainty that suffering was mandatory, and I could feel the strain in their gene-forged minds as centuries of indoctrination collided with immediate evidence, because their training had prepared them to resist corruption, not contradiction. The Chaos counterstroke was brutal, a last desperate surge, as the gods pushed their servants to extremes. And I was forced to fight then, truly fight. But even as chakra constructs slammed into corrupted armor and shattered blades, I refused to let hatred guide me, disabling, containing, pushing threats away from the civilians rather than annihilating them. And each choice was a knife edge, because one mistake would confirm every warning the Imperium had ever preached. When a warp rift began to widen above the hive, fed by panic and desperation from both sides, I understood that there would be no clean victory, only mitigation, and I made the hardest decision of my life, channeling everything I had into a single act, not of power but of example, pouring chakra outward in a sustained field that dampened emotional extremes, not erasing fear or pain but preventing them from escalating into frenzy. And the rift stalled, shuddered, and slowly began to close, not because I overpowered it, but because it no longer had enough fuel. The backlash nearly killed me, my vision tunneling, my body shaking as if reality itself resisted being calmed, and in that moment, I felt the Emperor again, closer than before, a vast presence straining against his own constraints. And for a heartbeat, I sensed something like approval, or maybe relief, before the connection faded. The battle ended not with cheers, but with exhaustion, chaos, withdrawing, and confusion. The Imperium standing amid ruins, unsure whether to press the trigger, and as Medicae servitors tended to the wounded civilians, Space Marines quietly assisted without orders, their movements stiff but deliberate. And I knew then that nothing had truly changed yet, that the Imperium would not suddenly become kind, that chaos would not simply starve, but that a precedent had been set, a small, dangerous data point logged into the galaxy's endless ledgers. Fear was not the only stabilizer. As I collapsed among the people I had tried to protect, hunted, condemned, and misunderstood, I accepted the terrible truth that my role here was not to save the galaxy in one shining act, but to endure, to remain present long enough for others to witness an alternative, and that meant living with being a target forever. Because the most frightening thing you can show an empire built on despair is proof that it could survive without it. The galaxy did not end after that battle, which in some ways was the cruelest outcome of all, because dawn came to the hive world not with revelation but with paperwork, orbital traffic resuming, casualty numbers revised, and the Imperium doing what it had always done best, absorbing anomaly and to process it. Beneath that surface normality, something subtle had shifted, a fault line. So small it could be denied, but real enough to be felt by those who listened. I learned this while recovering in the shadowed places where administratum lights never reached, my body aching with a deep, structural exhaustion that chakra could not instantly mend. Because sustaining calm in a universe addicted to extremes demanded more than strength. It demanded presence. And as I lay among survivors who now spoke in hushed voices, not of miracles but of choices, I felt the weight of what I had become settle fully into me, not a savior, not a symbol, but a variable that refused to resolve. The Imperium's response arrived in fragments never officially acknowledged, Space Marines reassigned rather than praised, inquisitorial records sealed under classifications that implied danger through silence, ecclesiarchy sermons subtly altered to emphasize perseverance without quite leaning so hard on terror. And I understood that institutions this old did not turn. They eroded, and erosion was slow, patient, often invisible, but relentless. Chaos reacted more violently, cult uprisings flaring unpredictably as the gods tested regions where emotional saturation had dipped, demonic incursions failing in places where communities held together instead of fracturing. And the gods noticed, not in rage alone but in calculation, because starvation taught adaptation, and the thought chilled me. Knowing that this war would never end cleanly, only change shape. I was summoned at last, not to terror, not in chains, but to a meeting that was not officially a meeting, a gathering of representatives who spoke carefully, acknowledging without admitting, asking without requesting, probing the boundaries of what I would tolerate, and I answered them honestly again, telling them I would not replace the Emperor, would not dismantle the Imperium by force, would not lead rebellions or preach doctrines. That all I would do was go where people were breaking and help them stand without demanding they kneel. And the silence that followed was heavy with fear, not of me, but of implication, because if hope could be localized, then it could spread. The Emperor's presence brushed mine one final time during that exchange, faint but unmistakable, a pressure like a mountain shifting by a fraction of an inch, and I felt an echo of something ancient and buried regret, perhaps. Or long-ended, and I realized with a quiet sorrow that even gods could become trapped by the structures built to sustain them. My sentence, if it could be called that, was exile without banishment, allowed to exist but never to settle, monitored but not contained, a wandering anomaly whose removal might do more harm than tolerance. And as I departed that world aboard a vessel crewed by people who chose to come with me rather than be ordered, I felt the full aching truth of it all crystallize. This galaxy would not be saved by a single act, or a single person, but by accumulation, by millions of small refusals to surrender empathy. My journey became quieter after that, moving from system to system, never staying long enough to become doctrine, helping where I could, leaving before belief hardened into worship. And everywhere I went the pattern repeated in small, fragile civilians organizing evacuations without panic, soldiers hesitating just long enough to spare the helpless, psychers discovering that discipline could exist without terror, and each instance was a candle in a hurricane, easy to extinguish, but devastating in number. Chaos hunted me relentlessly, not always with armies but with narratives, trying to frame my influence as weakness. Betrayal, a luxury humanity could not afford, and sometimes I doubted myself because I saw the cost to the worlds where hesitation led to catastrophe, the people who died because they believed there might be another way, and those nights were the hardest, lying awake listening to the hum of warp drives, wondering if the Imperium had been right to fear hope. The answer never came as certainty, only as choice, repeated endlessly, because what I had brought into this universe was not salvation, but permission. The permission to imagine survival without surrendering your soul, and permission was dangerous, because it made people responsible for what they allowed to continue. In time, whispers spread even among the Astartes, not of rebellion but of restraint, chapters developing subtle cultural deviations, emphasizing protection over punishment, recording anomalies not just as threats but as lessons. And somewhere in the warp the gods adjusted their hungers, learning to exploit subtler fractures, because nothing here ever truly died, it only evolved. I aged differently in this place, chakra sustaining me beyond normal limits, watching generations rise and fall, seeing small changes accumulate like sediment, And I understood, at last, the final, terrible irony of this universe, that the most radical act was not defiance, but consistency, showing up again and again with compassion until cruelty had to work harder to justify itself. In the end, if there could be said to be an end, I stood on a quiet observation deck, looking out at a galaxy still burning, still screaming, but no longer quite so convinced that screaming was the only option, and I accepted that I would never see victory here, never hear a choir sing of peace, never dismantle the structures that crushed billions. But I also accepted something else, something steady and unbreakable, that, as long as even a few people remembered that power could come from bonds rather than fear, this universe was no longer closed, no longer inevitable, and that was enough, because hope did not need to conquer the darkness to matter, it only needed to survive it.